a production of the New Jersey Courts.
I wanted to ask a little bit more about where your motivation came from to succeed. I mean, as noted in some of the material, it was unusual for African American students to go beyond the 7th grade. And you were very driven to shape all parts of your life to succeed in the academic realm. What was there a mentor? Was it coming from your family? What was driving you in that arena?
I've asked myself that question a number of times, and I have not come up with a definitive answer except to conclude that it probably was a combination of negative and positive factors. Negative factor would be one, is that my mother had been suffering with diabetes for a very long time. And I wanted to try to do any and everything I could to not only help her feel and get better. I didn't know at the time that there was no cure for diabetes, but I wanted to do what I could to try to help her. So I knew I needed to get a good education, and having no money to go to college or professional school, I needed to try to qualify for a scholarship. So that was part of it. And so in that context, one of the goals that I had in mind early in life was try to become a medical doctor. But in high school, I discovered that I was allergic to many chemicals in the chemistry course that I was taking. And I knew that at that time, in medical school, you were working on real cadavers, not plastic. Gray's Anatomy was the book that was used, and you were working on dissecting real corpse with a lot of chemicals, of course, to preserve them. So it didn't take me long to realize that I would not be able to pursue that. The original desire that I had, because I had been so involved in the church, was to become a Baptist minister. But as I've said from time to time, there was an old saying that virtually all of the Baptist ministers were used, and that is, the Lord had called him or her to become a preacher. And when I did not get that call, probably for reasons other than not having a telephone, I decided that I had to do something else. And then I came to understand that there is a strong similarity between the healing process that goes on between a religious leader, a medical doctor, and a lawyer, judge, who wants to try to do justice to everyone. And when I realized that, my focus then shifted to wanting to become a lawyer and a judge that I eventually categorized as being a secular minister for justice. Now, those were big ideas in a young poor boy growing up in an inferior educational system. But that did not stop me for 1 second. I wanted to be able to do things that would help to make America better than the America in which I had grown up. I had always believed that there was meaning to what is inscribed on the Statue of Liberty. You know, extending a hand to the poor, to the weak, to the foreign person, to come to America and become part of the American dream. I wanted part of that dream, but in a different way, not to make money, but to try to be of service to mankind. And that was the motivation that kept me moving forward. And along the road, I had a lot of teachers who detected those qualities in me and would do any and everything they could to help push me along. Never give me money, of course, to help pay the bill, but wanting to tutor if I need to be tutored without charge and things of that sort.
Before we get too much further in your education, I wanted to just ask about the impact of World War II. It seems to have impacted your family. You had older brothers go off to the service. You talked about Victory Gardens. Any other memories of how the war impacted your family? And I'm curious particularly, did your brothers come back with changed attitudes towards life as a result of their service?
Yes, they often, well, the brothers who had gone to war did not have the drive for greater education as I had. But in their own humble way, they came back talking about all of the wonderful things that they had experienced in the foreign countries, and were trying to think of ways to try to help fix America. That we shipped the young men off to a foreign land in the name of fighting for freedom, and yet to return home and find that you don't have much freedom because of the concept of Jim Crowism, which means all of those laws that were passed somewhere near the end of the era of Reconstruction that created even more segregation as a matter of law, in contrast to segregation based on custom and conditions, known more as de jure segregation. So they were disappointed that they had fought on foreign soil only to come back home and not be able to find a job. You have to remember now, when they came back at the end of World War II, Brown v. Board of Education was at least 10 years before it would be decided. And it took Brown probably another 15 years before you would see any real implementation in the South because of the fights that had gone on. So they were distressed. And consequently, one of them migrated to New Jersey. That was a brother with whom I lived when I finished high school. One went to Baltimore, but Baltimore was not that different from Virginia at the time. And one stayed in Virginia, and he used his skills that he had learned in the Army to become a carpenter and a plumber.
So you told the story earlier about going to the restaurant, first having to go to the back window, not being able to be served with white customers, and then the waitress or counter person smashing the glass. Do any other memories come to mind? I'm sure there's many of that kind of blatant racism, and where it was very clear that African Americans were not welcome or equal in the town.
Well, oh yes, it was going on all the time. One illustration is my family owned the land on which we were living, and in walking distance of our house was a family that was a sharecropper, and a white fellow family, and I used to play with the son, and he would never call me by my name. Everybody knew my nickname was Junie, for Junior, and rather than to call me by my nickname, he would always call me by the N-word, and I don't mean Negro. And I felt offended at first, but then again, going back to my religious belief, I wanted to be more forgiving. I say forgiving in a more spiritual or religious sense, but in the final analysis, I think that I was learning to be obedient enough to stay out of trouble because I had long-term goals. And if I were to engage in fistfights or anything that may lead to fistfights as a result of having been called the N-word or mistreated in other respects. I knew that would dim my chances of succeeding in some of the things I wanted to do. So, as I've said in some speeches, I learned how to live under the conditions that existed and learn how not to fight because I could not win that battle at that time. And I wanted to have a chance to prepare to be able to win battles.
Now you said you went up to Wesley College up in Massachusetts when you were a junior in high school. Before that, had you ever traveled really outside of Brunswick County?
I traveled outside of Brunswick, but not very far outside of Brunswick. I think I had gone to Petersburg and or Richmond, and I had gone into North Carolina because when it was time to sell the tobacco that we had grown, my father would use anecdotal information to determine which may be the best place. They had a warehouse in Lawrenceville, but he thought that in North Carolina he may be able to get a better price for his tobacco. And so I would travel with him from time to time into North Carolina. And in that same context, talking about racism, I used to try to persuade him not to stand near his tobacco because the auctioneer would get the inference that it is and may lowball them on the price. But he was too proud to leave it, and I couldn't convince him. And I have no doubt that that was happening to him. Yeah. But that's about the extent of the travel. I had no money. Oh, that was another time, now that I think about it. My sister was dating a fellow, and they wanted to go to Baltimore for some concert, I think it was. And my father wouldn't allow my sister to go without me escorting her. So I got to go to Baltimore, and there was a jazz concert that I attended in Baltimore. And I remember until this day that Vi Burnside was a saxophonist in that jazz concert. And it was enjoyable. So that was the extent of my travel. And so many times when I wanted to go into the town of Lawrenceville, I would hitchhike. And at that time, I was unaware that I may have been violating the law, as I later discovered. As I have said in a couple of speeches, hitchhikers were arrested and put in jail and deprived and disenfranchised even. And more recently, the governor of Virginia re-enfranchised some of those people by executive order. And then the Supreme Court of Virginia in last July issued an opinion saying that the governor did not have the authority to restore those persons' civil rights. But that indicates how some of the system of separate but equal concept still prevails in some part of our wonderful America.
You noted in some of your writings that any action, any sort of routine action could be grounds for potentially getting arrested, like loitering, being unemployed. Were there ever any times in your young life where you felt like you were being threatened or harassed by local law enforcement, local authorities, or maybe your friends or members of your family?
Oh, friends and members of the family were, but I never was. Again, and I think in part because I learned early my place in the society in Virginia, and that it would be in my best interest to try to stay in my place. Now, I changed, of course, later on. Now, we can talk about that, that change that came. But some friends were, and I knew a couple of people, relatives, who were arrested allegedly because they were drunk and disorderly, when I have no idea whether it was a factual predicate for it, but I have a feeling that that was a problem that was created only because of their racial identity rather than because the facts warranted it. But I never see it, yeah. Now, when I would go to the Dewdrop, typical Southern name dance hall, I would improve my ability on the track field to run from gunfire that was fired in the floor, in the ceiling of the dance hall, and run and hide behind cars and so forth. But none of those people were arrested. There were African Americans, according to my father, who were involved in selling moonshine whiskey, which is illegally produced whiskey, and they were arrested from time to time. But he would tell me that many of those times, the arresting officer would be bribed and the charge would be dismissed by giving him a couple of gallons of moonshine whiskey. Yeah.
Hey, you brought up the Dewdrop Inn and the dancing. When you say people were shooting, were they just, was it like criminal activity? Were they just shooting off as for fun, or?
Well, I think that most of the time it may have been because somebody had asked the shooter's girlfriend or date to dance with him.
Oh.
And he didn't like that. So in order to try to scare the fellow away, he would shoot in the floor, shoot in the air. But I wasn't going to stick around to find out which of.
Smart. Well, tell me a little bit about your decision to go on to college, specifically at Virginia State University. Why did you choose that? Did you have other options? Did you ever consider going out of state?
Oh, I did, and one of the consideration was to go to Morehouse College, which is a famous black college in Atlanta. But I quickly rid myself of that idea when I said, number one, I have a good college 50 miles away from home, and I have a scholarship. My recollection is the scholarship was less than $500 a year, but the overall cost, including room, board, tuition, and laundry, was less than $500 a semester or a year. I've forgotten the numbers now, but very low. But that low number has to be viewed in the context of the average wage. Many of the people working in the public sector were earning less than $1 an hour. And Uncle was working in the pulpwood mill, earning, I think, about 75 cents an hour. I would plow the garden of people and make about 25 cents an hour. So the cost of that college education in relation to the average wage may be regarded as high. And I had the scholarship, and Mr. Burwell had arranged for me to get a job on campus, so it was pretty much a work-study program viewed in that context. So I worked in college for about 35 to 40 hours a week, earning 50 cents an hour. And that plus summer earnings, along with the scholarship, paid for all of my education expenses. I did not apply for undergraduate because at that time you had to spend money to send money with the application. And I was going to save my few dollars because I was very thrifty.
We were talking about coming to Virginia State University?
Yeah. It was a wonderful university, and I had been there on a number of occasions attending regional conferences in which I met a lot of other people, and was introduced to some of the faculty. I liked everything about it. It was a much larger campus than St. Paul's, where I had gone to high school. And I didn't have any money, so there was no need in applying elsewhere. And I did not know what the process would be for trying to get scholarship money as a non-resident or being from a different area. In order to have gone to one of the other colleges, I would have been forced to come to probably New Jersey and New York, or go to California and maybe in Chicago.
Well, what were your first few days and weeks on campus like for you? I mean, this had been a goal of yours for quite some time. What was it like to actually be getting into college life?
It wasn't that difficult, because my freshman year, I had 2 or 3 roommates, and one of those roommates had been a high school classmate of mine, and we were very close, still are close. So there was comfort in that. I adjusted fairly well, because I came with the knowledge that I had to work in order to earn the extra money, not extra, but the additional money that I needed to stay in college. So I did not have the typical college life experience in that. Let me back up for a second. They had a dining hall, and the food for meals were served family style in the dining hall. The students would tend to gather outside of the dining hall, both before and after the meal, to do a lot of chatting. And the academic buildings were all around the dining hall. I was deprived of that because I had a job at the infirmary, which was on the other end of the campus, in walking distance from my dormitory though. So I didn't get to socialize much during those times. And I had to work 7 days a week. I had a girlfriend, and we made arrangements that, I would meet her in her dorm. And when I say in her dorm, I mean in the lobby, because at that time, boys could not go to the girls' room, and the girls couldn't go to the boys' room. And if anybody ever tried to do it, you were expelled from school. That's how serious they were with those practices. But I started out singing in the a cappella choir my freshman year on campus, and I saw it was too time consuming. And I played football in high school my senior year. And by the way, I'd gotten a scholarship from being the high school class salutatorian. And I don't recall whether that scholarship was limited to going to Virginia State or not, but it didn't matter because that's where I had planned to go. And so I went out for football my freshman year, and I looked to my left and looked to my right and said, I have an academic scholarship. These guys are not going to knock my brains out. So I gave up trying to play football. And then I eventually, this is the freshman year, but the fraternity life started when I pledged the end of the freshman year and went over the fraternity second year. So my socializing life on college campus was somewhat limited, but I had no complaints because I was very serious about my mission in life, and I intended to spend the bulk of my time preparing myself for the future.
Now, you were at Virginia State University from 1952 to 1956?
Yes.
Okay. Which, it was just at the time that the civil rights movement was picking up steam. I think the bus boycott in Montgomery was in your junior year or so?
Yes.
Were these events discussed on campus much?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes, very much so. As a matter of fact, so much so that we had a protest movement on campus, protesting the quality of the food in the dining hall. And the president of the university made it clear that if the protest didn't end in a very short period of time, all of the person who could be identified as protesting would be expelled. That's the kind of authoritarian rule that existed at that time. And we were involved in NAACP activities, trying to help raise money and helping more in law school than in college, help prepare the cases and trying to do things of that sort and be vigilant in the community and trying to help the local chapter of NAACP, that's the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, raise money, small amounts though it may be. So we went to several churches in the area, and it turned out one of the big churches at that time was headed by a high school classmate of mine, and he was instrumental in helping to raise funds for our campus chapter. Yeah.
So tell me about any professors that stand out in your memory or classes, any one who maybe served as a mentor or that sort of role in your life?
Well, we're in college, so let me back up for a second.
Sure.
I talked about the segregated or Jim Crow education that I had received. And I'm in a rural area when I'm in high school and elementary school. And when I get to college, I'm competing with students who've gone to the so-called cream of the crop of Jim Crow education. And the cream of the crop existed in places like Richmond, Virginia, Maggie Walker High School there, Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., a couple of high schools on the eastern shore in the Norfolk Tidewater area, Virginia, who had some teachers with advanced degrees, doctorate degrees. And some of them had the doctorate degrees because they were fortunate enough to have matriculated at some of the predominant white universities in the North and couldn't find jobs anywhere, so they came back to the segregated school system. And that was happening in college too. So when I go off to college, freshman orientation week, I'm surprised because for the first time, I discovered that you have to take standardized testing to determine which courses you can take in English and math. And I not only not heard about standardized testing, but I'd never taken one. So I experienced essentially deer in my headlights because I didn't do well on those tests and ended up in English going into a not-for-credit English course. So the first week in that course, if not the first couple of days, that English professor made an assignment to us saying, the assignment for the next class is to bring in the definition of a scholar. And I was impressed by the assignment. So I go to the library, and I don't remember now how I went beyond reading all of the dictionary definition of a scholar. But I found something that impressed me, and it has been with me all of my professional life. And I told that same story when I delivered the commencement speech in 1995 at my college alma mater. And so I was not impressed with all of those or any of those definitions. So I found something that Ralph Waldo Emerson had written, and it was called an oration that he had given in 1837 at the Phi Beta Society oration in Boston, Massachusetts. Here's what he said, and I'll read it to be exact. He said, "The scholar is that man," and I add nowadays, or woman, "who must take upon himself or herself all the ability of the time, all the contributions of the past, all the hopes for the future. He must be an university of knowledge. If there be one lesson more than another which should pierce his ear, it is, the world is nothing, the man is all. In yourself is the law of all nature, and you know not yet how a global of sap ascends. In yourself slumbers the whole of reason. It is for you to know all. It is for you to do all. Mr. President and gentlemen, the confidence in the unsearched might of man belongs by all motive, by all prophecy, all preparation to the American scholar. That description stuck with me all these years. And that was the standard that I immediately started to strive for.